Okay, well, thank you, Lori. Starting back with the talking about the Axial Age, I was thinking about the Greeks and the slide that had all three, the Greeks and the India and China, and recalling some of the factors that caused that development to begin around 800 BC. And thinking about the more distinction beginning to define clearly society based on the borders and beginning to develop a hierarchical form of government was also accompanied by an intensification of urban development. And jumping back to China back then, and we talked about Lao Tzu, and the person or the time period when the Tao Te Ching was developed. And one thing about the Tao Te Ching, I talked to an elder on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation who was a professor at Santa Galesca University, it means Spotted Tail University, on that reservation. And his name was Albert Whitehat Sr. And he was a scholar and a linguist. And he had developed a Lakota linguistics program at the university because a lot of Lakotas don't speak their own language, even on the reservation. And so if you, when they would go to college, they could take a courses or classes to learn their own language. And I was talking to him and about spirituality one day, and we were talking about, is there any real similarity between any of the spiritual traditions throughout the world and Lakota? He said, only one, and that's the Tao Te Ching. So the only one that he knew of that had any real similarities to Lakota spirituality. But what's interesting too is, if you'll remember, we talked about Lao Tzu wanting to get away from the urban atmosphere and wanting to go into a calmer, more peaceful type of place. But the guards of the city wouldn't let him leave until he wrote some down. Well, Lao Tzu didn't really believe in writing. He believed in personal interaction. And, but he finally agreed to write certain of his teachings down, and then the guards would let him go. And I think that's kind of really an interesting thing where you have a crossroads happening in human socio-political systems emerging, and not everybody goes with it. Not everybody feels comfortable with it. And certainly Lao Tzu didn't. But during that time, you know, when we were talking about that, there was another scholar by the name of Confucius. And Confucius fit right into this urban setting because his writings were about proper social conduct and how you should conduct yourself and that kind of thing. And what's interesting is we turn into the 20th century, we have the rise in China of Chiang Kai-shek as a dictator. And Chiang Kai-shek outlaws both Buddhism and the Tao. But he keeps Confucius because Confucius is about social order. And Chiang Kai-shek liked that idea of social order. And then we get to Mao Zedong, and he decides to do away with Confucius as well. And this is a sidelight, doesn't have anything to do with where I'm going, but if you've been to the Nelson-Atkins Museum and you've gone into the Chinese section, where the Bodhisattva statues are located. If you walk into that temple area, if you've been there, and the Bodhisattva, there's one Bodhisattva in the center behind a painted wall that has the Guanyin, which is one of the types of Bodhisattvas. What's interesting is that the Nelson-Atkins got that statue during the time when that was all being discouraged. And I believe that was purchased in 1932. I hosted years ago a scholar. She got her degree, PhD, from Columbia University in New York in ethnicity and art, and went to Japan and was a professor in Japanese universities for a number of years, and returned back to the States to become dean of an art school in Manhattan Island. She came to Kansas City for one reason. She came to see Guanyin, the Bodhisattva in that temple area in the Nelson-Atkins. And when she walked into that room, she had tears, because she considers that one of the three finest sculptural masterpieces in the world. So she came to Kansas City just for that. And I think that's kind of an interesting sidelight when we're talking about Chinese history, and got a little off the track there, but I had to brag a little bit about the Nelson, which is, of course, closed right now. But back to this idea of urbanization as a key human development in the Axial Age, I think is a critical issue, along with the borders and that kind of thing. And the fact that Lao Tzu was not comfortable there, but people like Confucius stayed and tried to develop a sense of social order in the area. We find, jumping over to Greece at that time period, what's interesting too, we already talked about Pythagoras and Socrates and so on, but another scholar in Athens, Aristotle, and his words are quite fascinating when you look at what Aristotle was proposing. He was talking about a nation state, and Aristotle was convinced that cities were the only way that mankind could become really human. That human beings were not really fully human until they were in cities. This is an interesting comment about Aristotle and this idea about urbanization. Then he said, and if you want to reach the pinnacle and be 100% human, there's only a very few ways you can be totally human. The rest of you will be kind of sort of human, but not altogether human. One of the ways you became human was to become leader of the state, like a Pericles, where Athens was thriving under Pericles and the Delian League. Pericles was 100% human. The only other ways you could be 100% human is by becoming a philosopher, like myself. You know, Aristotle, you can see, I'm a philosopher, I'm totally human, therefore philosophers have the potential of becoming 100% human. Then he also considered artists to become 100% human. But the human, you had to be urban, and then you had to pursue one of these fields. And if you did that, then you had the potential of fully developing your humanity. I think that's just a fascinating concept about what the forces of urbanization were doing to this abstract ideology that we've been talking about. Suddenly we're getting these splits and the borders and this rise of abstract ideology. That also places something different into the Western mind. The Western mind now can begin to think that if you're not like us, you're not quite human. You may look human, but if you don't meet these certain criteria, you're not quite human. And so you begin to see a groundwork laid here, a thought process in this abstract ideological development that was developing during the Axial Age. And so that takes us right to Columbus, or Cristobal Colon. And in his book, Modular Mundi, this massive work that we talked about last week, where there were, where Columbus purchased his copy around, we'll say, circa 1480 of the Modular Mundi, with over 900 notations in the margins of this book, which is trying to design a way to circumvent the globe so that the entire human race can be Christianized for the second coming of Christ. And those who cannot be Christianized should be killed. And so you see the groundwork laid by Aristotle, kind of the sense of exclusivity that gets passed on eventually and reinforced by the contextual sense of living in more and more urbanized settings and identification of countries. You begin to get, and of course in the Greek case it was city-states, you begin to get this sense of exclusivity developing on more than one level. The them and us kind of thought process is becoming very closely solidified. I think there's a reason, I'm jumping just a little bit ahead here, but I think there's a reason why at Jamestown and at Plymouth, that these first Europeans landing there were not wiped out. Because the populations they met there were of a different mind, a completely different mind. And we kind of want to begin to move into that and see just what those differences actually were. So we come here with the Columbian Exchange, and a lot of things begin to happen in this exchange, mainly because the American hemisphere had been separated for who knows how long, really. They keep pushing the dates back further and further. Right now, some of the latest dates are going back to 16,000 years ago. I like to put that into perspective too when we talk about 16,000 years. My ancestors, which are German and Scots-Irish with a drop of French, did not get into Western Europe until 4,000 years ago, where you have a migration coming out of the Asian steppe region around the Caspian Black Sea. And the Indo-Aryan migrations, some of them went west into Western Europe, some of them moved south through the Khyber Pass into what we now call India, Iran, and that area. The India, Iranian, and the Western Europeans all originated, at least a big part of that population originated from the same place Western Europeans did. And then later migrations into North and South America and so on. But I think the dates are interesting. That migration into Europe, my ancestors, was only 4,000 years ago. Native peoples, now they're kind of pushing that date back as far back as 16,000 years. that they were occupying this hemisphere. So who knows how, if that keeps going back or not, but I just think it's a kind of an interesting comparison here. So I want to carry Modular Mundi into North America. And the idea of Modular Mundi that we must convert the savages in this case to Christianity, or those who cannot be converted must be killed. And so I want to come back in here and back to James Axial and quote him. From its inception, the invasion in North America was launched on waves of pious intent. Nearly all colonial charters granted by French and English monarchs in the 16th and 17th centuries assigned the wish to extend the Christian church and to save savage souls as a principal, if not the principal, motivation for colonization. And here the picture, you see the covered wagons and the stagecoach and so on. And on the left-hand side, you see native peoples trying to escape along with the buffalo and so on. And the spirit moving across the sky with a Bible in her hand. Manifest destiny. And we already covered this. I keep adding things as we go along here, so I added that after we talked about this last week. But what I like about James Axial and this concept of ethnohistory is that he's saying, let's take an honest look here. Let's get rid of these words like savage and primitives and all this. I want to look a little bit deeper, and let's see really who these people are. Let's study the ethnicity of these people. And what he uncovers is that the Europeans did not run into an inferior people and an inferior development. What he uncovers here is that actually native peoples were actually very highly sophisticated. The criteria for judging a people has to go beyond tool use, has to go beyond some type of materialism, because not every culture focuses on materialistic development. And as they begin to look at this differently, a lot of more objectivity begin to enter into the intellectual discussion. So, beginning this new phase into American colonialism, we have the Spanish, of course, we have the French, the British, and the Portuguese, all becoming involved in this hemisphere. And even the Dutch, earlier on, the Dutch did not succeed, but they were also involved early on. But the English, the French, and the Spanish, and in Brazil, of course, the Portuguese, for reasons, became dominant in Brazil. And I believe Alan's addressed that before in his history of the colonial South America and so on. But here we have a picture of the British Army. As we talked about last week, a lineage-based people resisting a border-based people. And this is exactly what you see going on here. The native person defending his territory, coming out of a extended family-based socio-political system, tied into spirituality. And on the other hand, the redcoats into a nation state-based socio-political system, clashing, these two extreme groups or ways of human development clashing here. And so the question here says, at what cost to us? And most people, when they think about, even if people haven't studied much about Native peoples and so on, most people are going to assume that question's asking at what cost to them. I'm not asking that question. That's an obvious question. What I'm asking is, what cost does an invader pay? What cost is it to us for this happening in human history? So we start out with a typical story that's taught in our schools about colonization, that's taught in American schools. And here you see the arrival and the man giving thanks, and there's a certain amount of joy. We found a new land and so on. And I want to kind of address here. Yeah, can we move that over a little bit? Oh, good. Yeah, the landing of the Mayflower. And the first people they met on the Mayflower were the Wampanoag Indian Confederacy. I want to draw it back a little bit. 4 years before the landing of the Mayflower, disease hit the Wampanoags. And it's estimated they lost between 60 and 70% of their population. The disease came from English fishermen up in Nova Scotia who infected the native peoples up there, and then because there was no immunity, rapidly spread down very rapidly. And probably the disease was carried over by rats, which tended to occupy these ships. There's a debate as to whether humans would have carried those things that long. You know, the debate goes back and forth. But the fact is that the disease was beginning to impact. Another interesting sidelight here is Jacques Cartier, French, went down the St. Lawrence River, or up the St. Lawrence River, I should say, in 1536. He had three ships, and he stopped at an Iroquois town named Stadacona. And the crew, the French crew, had lost 28 sailors to scurvy. The rest of the sailors were all sick. In other words, they just made it to Stadacona, but they couldn't have gone much further. The medicine people there cured them. And then they went on down to Hochelaga, a much bigger Iroquois town, and visited there for a while, and then left, and then finally went back to France, and I believe they returned a year later. But when they returned a year later, Stadacona was having issues with disease the medicine people could not cure. And of course, historians are not going to really talk about that, mainly because no one knows where that came from. There's no way to identify it. And so it may have been some local something that happened, or it may have been brought by Jacques Cartier, but there's no way of knowing that. But the fact that you could trace it now from the English fishermen to the Wampanoags, which hit the Wampanoag people in 1616, was traceable. The Wampanoags call it the yellow disease. So there's some thought it could have been yellow fever, but no one really knows for sure. But the leader of the Wampanoags at that time, the paramount sachem, or what we call chief, was Massasoit. And there was a relatively friendly existence between them at that point in time, which lasted for quite a while until one of the sons of Massasoit, Wamsuta, was murdered. And there's a lot of tension going on at this point, and some people being murdered and so on. It wasn't explained and so on. The younger son, Metacom, then took over, and there was a war between the Wampanoags and the Puritans at that point, and that became known as King Philip's War. But they were able to sustain peace for quite a long time. But during that time, things were happening to their environment. I want to point out another very good scholar, William Cronin. Got his Doctor of Philosophy from Jesus College, Oxford, and was a Rhodes Scholar, 1976-78, a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, MA, and also Master of Philosophy and PhD from Yale University. Now, I'd like to give the credentials of these various scholars, and he did a landmark work in a book called Changes in the Land. Is an excellent book, but I tried to take from that book a summary because he dealt with a lot of other things like the effects of bringing animals foreign to the area into the community. He also mentions that malaria came over, which is interesting because most people think of malaria coming out of Africa, but there is a species of mosquito that lives at the mouth of the Thames River, a marshy area, which apparently the ships coming over here brought these mosquitoes over, and malaria was hitting the native populations as well as other diseases pretty seriously. But what I tried to do here is just summarize very briefly what he brings out about environmental changes that were happening. So I'll just read over this. Failed European methods transplanted to America, landscapes as commodities, did not recognize ecosystems function as a whole. Unlike native peoples, viewed ecosystem members as isolated and extractable. So it's interesting, native people saw the ecosystem, including themselves and their own bodies, as a single unit coming from a single source of creation. We'll get into that later. The old growth forest destroyed. Different species of trees were harvested for specific purposes. Example, white oak used for ship hulls, hickory for ship masts. Also, colonists used wood for roof shingles, housing sidings. Lumber was shipped to England for furniture production and so on. So you're getting a lot of deforestation that begins to happen pretty quickly especially after the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony merge into one colony. So you have only one under the English crown operating here. Then a massive deforestation, farming, climate became sunnier, windier, hotter, colder, drier than under the native domain, causing more flooding. And therefore, mosquitoes that were being brought over and malaria. Severe soil erosion due to deforestation and domestication of animal grazing. A lot of the animals, the cattle were fenced in, but the hogs were often allowed to roam free, which of course went right into native gardens. And this was seriously disturbing to the native peoples. So the native agriculture was seriously compromised. If anybody would like to go further into this, I would highly recommend William Cronin's book, Changes in the Land. because he's talking about New England, but you can also apply that pretty much to what was happening throughout North America as the migrations continued to push westward. Only 17 years after the landing of the Mayflower, the Puritans decided that the Pequot Indians were troublesome. And they had lost fewer from European-brought diseases than some of the other tribes. Their location was in what today we'd call eastern Connecticut, was where their land was, pretty close to the Narragansett Bay there. And since they had lost fewer from disease, and there was more and more conflict and tension was happening between the Pequots and the Puritans and so on. The Puritans, and plus they wanted Pequot land. It was land they felt like they could expand into. They decided to attack this Pequot town. Wee hours of the morning, they attacked and took the town by surprise, but they started setting the houses on fire. And some people were trapped inside, other people got out. But the warriors of the Pequots recouped themselves and managed to begin to put up resistance, and the Puritans began to withdraw out of the town. But they blocked the exit ways from the town. And anyone that was trying to get out of there, they could easily kill. The Narragansett and Mohican people had allied themselves with the Puritans, but this is the first time they saw European-style warfare. And they started pleading with the Puritans to stop, because little children were being killed, women, elders were being killed, and they tried to plead with them. And finally, the Narragansetts and the Mohicans left. But when this was over with, there were something like 700 Pequots that were massacred. So now the conflicts are out there and pretty apparent as to what was going to happen here. So then we move on, and we're talking about nation-state proclivities towards expansion. There always seems to be this proclivity towards expansion. And so we get to this point today, we jump up to today. What is the reality today? The rise of exclusivity, objectification, and masculine domination. Still continuing. When we talk about the context of rising urbanization and the separation from the natural world and things like that, things begin to shift in our humanity. Things begin to happen. And so we have the borders, as you see in the upper right-hand corner. Next to it, we have the children on the border now in cages on the border. But down below, the original people of the land, on the plains, the reservation, housing. Trying to remember that picture, it's been a long time, the one next to it. But the one further over is the native peoples in the water, with the militarized police force blocking the native peoples at Standing Rock in the 2016. Which Standing Rock finally hit the news after about 5 months of this going on. Brexit, is it worth it in England? We find Syrian refugees in the water next to that picture. Another one, Moscow, and the Capitol building, and so on. What is it? What is the reality today? And the most recent that we're seeing here now are the demonstrations in our city streets and the protests. I want to address just very briefly the kind of the nature of protests. When you get this happening, and it happened with Gandhi, we talked about last week, and so on. There's a core group that have a real legitimate reason for the demonstrations. And you see the masses during the day in Kansas City here, they're happening every day here, in New York City, Los Angeles, Seattle, Houston, which were triggered by the death of George Floyd. But then they're listing all these other people that have died. And Native peoples have had the same experiences here. So we're getting a sense of sincerity in the movement, but there's always a fringe group that will attach itself. And we see that happening. What that have other agendas, but they see an opportunity. And that's where the violence happens. That's where, when you drive through the plaza today, you see boarded up windows. Because that wasn't done, likely, probably was not done by the core group of the protest, but was done by a fringe group which came in to take that opportunity for who knows what their agenda is, but it's usually another kind of agenda that does the destruction thing. The caution is to not take away from the legitimate group, allow the fringe groups to take away the legitimacy of the protest itself. That's the key challenge when we're dealing with this kind of situation. One's a very plus thing, and of course it's our constitutional right to do these protests. So just briefly, again, going back of the Axial Age sphere. Now, the only reason I'm putting this back on is because this is how it applied to Native America. Basically, I'm thinking more in terms of today as opposed to, back at the very beginnings, the colonial period and the expansion west and so on. But today we have reservations. And the reservations have borders. And approximately, the statistics vary because there's some fluidity for one thing, but approximately 27 to 30% of all American Indians live on reservations. That means 70 to 72% live off the reservation. Some of those who live off are traditionals, like they'll go into the sun dances every year and participate, which is a very demanding ceremony. You can imagine taking your 2-week vacation off to go and participate in your traditional ceremonies from, say, Phoenix or Kansas City or Chicago, to go back to your home reservation to do this very intensive ceremony. And participants do a preparation and purification 4 days before a 4-day dance. So you're talking 8 days, and you only have 2 weeks off, and you have travel time and that. So you can imagine. But my point is, there's still traditional people out there that go into the cities and work in the cities as architects, as engineers, as day laborers, factory workers, you name it, maybe MDs, but they'll go back home for the traditional ceremonies. The institutionalization, the commoditization of property, alienation property rights. Like if you own a house on a lot, you have alienation rights to your property. In other words, no one but law enforcement is allowed on your property without your permission. Now, of course, that's flexible, obviously. but that's technically, that's the legal. Again, dealing with borders again, as far as our property rights are concerned. The rise of masculine domination. Indian children, excuse me, were forced into boarding schools in which they were not allowed to do anything culturally. I'll have to wait a minute to clear my voice. You guys can play cards or do something while I'm doing this. So the boarding schools where children were taken away from their homes, and the purpose of the boarding school was to erase their culture, to make them white. And American Indian spirituality was illegal in this country until 1978, when the Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed by Congress. Every other religion in this country was allowed except American Indian. So there was this attempt to erase that. I put under that masculine domination, abstract ideologies and exclusivity, the rise of racism, discrimination, and I call it delusional thinking, which of course is kind of an issue now we're dealing with in our with the protests, demonstrations, and yesterday, maybe some of you watched the funeral of George Floyd that went on, and of course, all these other people that had lost their lives were also brought into clear view at this point. So we have the rise of more aggressive societies, and I throw in there just the example of Trail of Tears and Trail of Death. The Northern Indians, for example, the Potawatomis live in Kansas. There's a Potawatomi reservation. Well, they're actually from Michigan originally. They were forced marched into this area. The Delawares, Lenni Lenape people, are from Delaware. They named the state after the Lenni Lenape people. Their reservation, it's not a reservation now, but their tribal council is now in Oklahoma. They were all forced marched into this area. Objectification, I've got stereotyping. Indians are primitives and savages, them and us. A lot of traditional native peoples are very concerned about Arrowhead Stadium and the tomahawk chop and what they consider the phony drum beats and things like that. I was at a meeting at the Kansas City Indian Center once of parents who came out of concern of their children. Excuse me again. Of their children going to school and being chopped at school and things like that. Every year, thousands of Native women are murdered and disappearing. And I have a slide on that way on later down probably the last week that we'll get into that. And at the tip of the spear, Standing Rock, that event, and some of you may have seen on the news this confrontation between the Omaha Indian Nathan Phillips and the Covington boys who were there for a certain reason. Nathan interjected himself with a prayer song there because there were 4 black Israelites who were taunting these boys, and the boys were starting, there was a lot of tension there, and Nathan came in with a prayer song, hoping to settle the thing down. And so the boys turned on him and started taunting him and started chopping at him. So I put that kind of at the tip of the spear there. So then I come in with this idea of, we've kind of set the background for 2 types of human organizations. 2 types of socio-political organizations. Tribal is one, and state is the other. So then I pose this question, and I realize this is like going upstream against the current. This question, what type of society serves the individual the best? And our concerns about what kind of society can we thrive as each individual human being? What kind of society can we thrive the best in? Does Aristotle give us a guide? Does Socrates give us a guide? Is Pythagoras or Lao Tzu or Confucius? Are any of these people giving us good insight into this question? Is it tribal types of organization, or is it the state socio-political? And on the state side, I put the 2 American flags, one with the 13 colonies and the 13 states, which became the original states, and the other with 50. The state level tends to be a system, as Carol Quigley talked about, we talked about earlier. Once you institutionalize something, the tendency for that is to expand. The 13 colonies now, not only coast to coast, but Alaska, Hawaii as well. So also looking at kind of a comparison, the state with tool use and tribal, the agricultural system, the Eastern tribal people, which relied on a gardening kind of agriculture. They didn't use these tools like that. They didn't use insecticides or fertilizers, anything like that. What they did use was symbiotic relationships. Excuse me. I remember teaching in the classroom, and I'd have sinus things, and you know, you learn how to get through it, but it's just part of. I'm still alive, yippee! At least I can have sinus trouble and still be alive, and so on. Anyway, back to the subject. Tribal people had a very highly developed knowledge of how nature interacted. And they knew how to get nature to interact on its own. One of the things they developed, this would be around 12, 13, 1400 AD, when the eastern woodlands began to farm, and corn didn't get up until into this area until Well, it was up as early as 900, but they didn't rely on it very much until around 1200 AD. But they developed a system which we call today the Three Sisters. So you'll have a little mound about 2 feet in diameter and maybe 6, 7 inches high, and you'd plant corn, 3 corn seeds in the middle. And then you would plant squash seeds around the edge. And then you would allow those to grow. Once the corn had cracked the surface of the earth and was up about 4 to 5 inches, you would plant beans seeds at the base. And then the bees would use the stalk to wrap around and support itself. Each 3 of the plants offered certain kinds of support systems, be it nutritional support systems, or like the squash would be shading the area so that nothing would grow under it. And I've been involved for some time with a garden out at Line Creek where resurrecting native gardens. Myself and a Pueblo man and his daughter from the Santo Domingo Pueblo, and he's using Pueblo style gardening, and I was using this Three Sisters. And I've read about this. I had no concept of what it really was like until I saw these plants grow. And the squash, the leaves were like 5, 6 deep, and they're huge, covering all that ground around there. Nothing could grow under it. And the corn stalks, we had to have this Parks Department, Kansas City Parks and Recreation, put in a fence 8 feet tall. The corn stalks were at least 12 feet tall. And I was amazed because we were using heirloom seeds, ancient heirloom seeds, and I was amazed at the production. It was incredible. And so these smaller gardens were extremely productive, and I could go into the history, but I'm feeling time limitations here as to how productive they really were. But as comparison, the native process of using these symbiotic relationships, and then what we did replace that with the tool use. There's another scholar I'd like to bring in here, Dr. Luis Benford. Got his bachelor's from North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and master's PhD from the University of Michigan, but in archaeology. And he started his studies out in the south of France. And there he came up with a new kind of archaeology, a whole different approach called processual archaeology. And let me read this. There's now a whole field called processual archaeology. And it's a whole school now that's been developed, and he started it. It was one of the most influential American archaeologists of the last half of the century, an early advocate of the more scientific approach to investigating ancient cultures. He proposed that his colleagues move beyond looking for historic artifacts to the study of human relationships to their environment. Dr. Benford observed that hunter-gatherer gardening cultures as early as the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods ate more nutritiously and had a long lifespan, which I think is fascinating because my brain thinks about linear progression, time equals progress. And then these new studies, this new approach and process, and his idea in processual archaeology is instead of studying a linear tool use process and growth, he studies the interrelationship and interaction of the group of people with their environment. And he's written a lot of books. This is one book I put up here as an example. And his wife, I'm trying to think of her first name, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Benford passed on. He moved to Kirksville, Missouri, which is interesting. And my youngest son, who's now an RN, got his first degree in anthropology. And he had Dr. Johnson, I wish I could think of her first name, Dr. Johnson as his mentor before, and that's before I went to get his RN degree. But it's fascinating because this whole new approach to archaeology. So now I want to get to a story. We've been talking about the nurturing of children and the fascinating aspect of Native peoples and their way of raising children. And I have an example of that. And I'd like to take a little time to pause here because I think it's very meaningful. And my son, the RN, started his career up the Rosebud Indian Reservation. Was up there for 2 years, and then a little over 2 years, and then moved up to Cheyenne River, where the Minnekoju Lakota people are up in the Cheyenne River Reservation. And he was working in the hospital up there. And so a total of 6 years that he spent up there. But some of the people he knew at the hospital and where he was living were reading this book, Washeka, The Bear Dreamer, a Lakota story based on Leon Hale's dream. And so he sent me a copy of the book. And what it is that Leon Hale is Minnekoju Lakota. And he kept having a very lengthy, very detailed dream. And he kept having it over and over and over again. And it went on for a number of years. And he finally, he wanted to get it recorded. And he finally found an author by the name of Jamie Lee who was willing to record this dream. And I want to go over about 1/5 of this book and just kind of try to summarize it the best I can. And perhaps before I do that, I should pause. Yeah, I only have 25 minutes left. Let me pause just for a minute to see if there are any questions or comments. Then we can move on. Lori, if...
As a reminder, you can unmute yourself to ask your question, or you can, in the chat box, let me know you need help.
Okay, if there are any comments or questions, I'd be glad to answer anything I can, or because we covered quite a bit of material so far. So,
I'm not seeing anything in the chat box, Gil.
okay,
and I'm not seeing anybody trying to unmute.
Okay, well, I'll take a positive thing that people are so excited about getting into this book that let's move on.
Okay.
Okay, I just want to start reading pieces of it, and then I'm going to have to summarize a lot to get it in. But the book starts out with with this first statement on page 1. It's entitled Ash. When a man's body is raised high on a scaffold, remember this is Lakota people out on the plains, and burned, skin and hair and bone black and crumbled, and becomes ash. The ash is lifted, carried by wind high above the earth and scattered. I am ash now. The day my body burned, the wind was blowing east, and it carried me aloft, lifting and lifting until the sun warmed the ash, and the rain washed me back to earth. Ash has eyes and memory. Spirit lingers in ash. When my body burned, I was freed from all physical restraints, free to fly like eagles and birds, free to mingle with the earth and water, to nourish the grasses and plants, to be eaten by deer and bear and wolf. And my body burned and became ash. I was no longer tethered by human limitations, but liberated, turned loose amidst the world, free to roam, to watch, to cross previously unseen boundaries between life and death, to be breathed by Wakantanka, the Great Spirit. I am still here. I was even free to be reborn 100 years later into the body of a boy in Thunder Butte, to ease myself into his dreams, to have him remember my story and tell it to others. The person who wrote that is Leon Hale. He remembers a former lifetime. And so that is him. So the first chapter of the book sets the stage, sets the context about living in their Lakota community out there in the plains, what life was kind of like. And the dream, which would have been Leon Hale's memory of a former lifetime, starts out at 11 years old, 11-year-old boys, and a cousin named Rabbit, Lakota word for cousin. There are a lot of words for cousin in Lakota, because these are relationship-oriented people. So is it a girl cousin, boy cousin, older, younger? They all have words which define a protocol of how you interact and relate. Because that's how relationship people operate usually when their societies are based on that as a lineage-based people. Excuse me. So this moves in to a time period when there are almost no white people out there. However, there's one family that the men have discovered. And so they don't know who these people are. They just know to call them the other. So that starts out, up until that moment, I had never thought about there being any other world but the one I knew. Until then, I had thought my world was the only world. I looked out across the prairie to the upper rise of the Black Hills and think the world must end, or my eyes could go no further. Grandfather told my stories about the world, but it was always the world we knew. Again and again, he'd tell us, we are Lakota Oyate, the people. I knew there were no worlds beyond this one, the realms of the spirits and the ancestors, but those were different realms. I knew there were many other bands of people living on the land. We'd seen them, traded with them, sometimes married them, and sometimes fought with them. But the others, grandfather described in a story, were a different kind of people. That's what he said, like an owl is different from a sparrow. So we have the story revolves around two boys, two 11-year-old boys. The Tahanchi, which was the one word for cousin, is named Rabbit. And the other boy is Itonton Chikala. Itonton Chikala in Lakota means a young person with leadership qualities, but he's really young. And the book chooses to use the English phrase, which isn't quite it, but it's as close as you can get. Uses the phrase little chief as his name, but his Lakota name is Itonton Chikala. And so the boy keeps having this dream, and the dream is of a white bear, and it's very persistent. And the white bear, it happens over and over again, night after night, he keeps having this dream of a white bear. But the white bear is tethered to a tree with a rope around its neck and is crying, and his neck is bleeding. And so the young 11-year-old Itonton Chikala, or Little Chief, goes to consult with his grandfather, Whirling Hand. The grandfather is an elder of the people. And he goes to talk to his grandfather, and he explains this recurrent dream to him. So after he gets through talking, grandfather says, "It's a sign, grandson. It's a sign that someday you must set the bear free." The dream came from Wakuntanka. It's really like a vision, an instruction. So Little Chief, or Itonton Chikala, goes to his cousin, his Tahanchi, whose name's Rabbit. As time passes, and he's talked this over with Rabbit, the dream is becoming so real that he begins to feel like the time has arrived, that he must go free the bear, the white bear. And one day he overhears a bunch of men around the fire talking about the other. This other people that have moved into the area, they're 2 days away, 2 days riding time away. And he hears them talking, and suddenly it clicks. He's talking about the white bear. He's talking about the people. That there's somebody there he must free. And so he talks to Rabbit. And at first, Rabbit, he says, "I've got to go free the bear." And he talks to Rabbit, his Tahanchi, his cousin, and Rabbit is reluctant. He expresses deep concern. I mean, they're only 11 years old. But Rabbit finally agrees, "Okay, I will accompany you." But Rabbit's concerned and he's afraid. But he says, "I'll accompany you." So they decide to get up early the next morning and leave. And before the sun's up, way in the kind of the wee hours of the morning, they both live in separate lodges, which the Lakota call teepees. They meet and they go get their horses, but the horses are designed for small boys. They're not the big hunting horses and things like that the grown men will ride. But anyway, they get their horses and they slip out of the community, out of the village, and they head out. So as they're passing, say just a minute here. As they're slipping down and they get out into the prairie at night, and they're moving along, and the sunrise is beginning, to awaken everything. And of course, the parents are getting up and awake, but the boys are long gone at this point. And they know that they've got 2 days ride in order to get to the other. Excuse me a minute, I'm looking for my my place here. Okay, as the riding through the day, a rabbit was quiet beside me, and we rode without talking. The night was long around us. Never had we been out this early or this far from camp. The stars seemed to pass down from the heavens, and the darkness made my ears keen. I heard every sound that the night contained. When we had ridden so long and the sun was finally touching the dark sky, Rabbit's silence began to worry me. In spite of our utter aloneness on the land, I felt the need to whisper, "Rabbit, yes? How are you?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'm afraid, little chief. The animals sleep. Nobody followed us. There is nothing to fear. No, little chief, I'm always afraid." I listened to the soft clop of the horses' hooves on the dry grass and considered his words. They were almost a confusion, a hum beneath the dark layer of the sky. Always afraid. I knew what it must have cost my cousin to come with me on this journey. Rabbit was born afraid. His mother had died birthing him, and I wondered if that was the center of his fear. Being in the world had cost his mother's much. Thank you for coming with me to Hanchi. We rode on in silence now. I thought back to when we were small, the times I'd found Rabbit alone behind a tree, or hidden behind a circle of stone. Always alone. The other children had teased him, twitching their noses at him, calling him Bunny and Baby. Once I'd asked grandfather why he had named me Little Chief. He said it was because my skin was loose. This had confused me. I remember pinching my upper arm and saying defensively, "My skin is not loose." Grandfather laughed at me and said, "It is, my grandson. You leave your skin and crawl into other people's skin. You wear their skin as if it were your own. Always talking, taking care of others, always feeling their sorrows and their joys. It is necessary thing for a good leader. That is why I named you Little Chief." At the time, I didn't grasp grandfather's words. Now, however, riding across the dark prairie, feeling the protection of the hills rescind behind us, I understood. I felt Rabbit's deep fear, had felt it for a long time. It was not the fear of physical danger, but something else, something in his spirit. It was the reason I had taken my cousin as friend. I had lost my skin and wore another's. I began to worry about mother as they rode through the day. He knew that his mother would be worrying about him. He thought about looking out across the prairie that they were crossing, how vast the prairie was. And he thought about his mother, his worrying mother. He thought about the ancestors. Hundreds of years, his ancestors had ridden across this prairie. He thought about what it would have been like then for them. but anybody as young as him and Rabbit had taken this kind of journey back, way back when the ancestors were here. Keeps thinking about White Bear and the rope around his neck. He hears the call of an owl. Finally, the day ends, and the horses do need to rest because they're not built for long journeys. They're just horses for boys. So they rest that night, and they hear the sounds of crickets and wind. In the morning, they awaken, and they head out early. They have to conserve their resources because they've only carried little food. They know how to gather food from the prairie, but they have to make sure that they keep on the move and they take care of the horses too, because the horses aren't used to such long trips. As they move through the vast prairie, finally arrive at their destination late afternoon. The destination looks like a grove, a huge grove of cottonwood trees. Cottonwood trees signal water. They knew they were by a stream. And they knew because of the description of the men that they had heard before discussing the others, they knew that they were close to the others. They knew that it was a 2-day ride approximately to get there. So they pretty well were on target. And so they tethered their horses on that side of the grove of cottonwood trees. And they began to slip through the cottonwood trees to the creek. They found a creek. And on the other side of the creek was a cabin and a barn. And they knew they had found the others. As they watched across the creek in the morning sun, suddenly 2 boys came out of the cabin. They looked like twins. One looked very strong, though, and the other looked very awkward. And as the boys walked from the cabin, they were heading towards the barn. Suddenly, the father came out of the house. He started yelling at the awkward boy. And he had a whip in his hand. He rushed over to the boy and started beating him and yelling at him. And the boy started crying. The father then took the boy and marched him down to the stream, to the creek, and tied him up to the tree by the creek, and put the rope around his neck. The boy had scabs around his neck where he had been tied before. The Toncha and Rabbit were shocked as they saw the treatment of the boy. Toncha immediately saw in the boy the White Bear dream. Immediately, he wants to run down and free the boy. He wants to fulfill the dream. The Rabbit convinces him it's too dangerous. You can't do that. We got to leave. We got to leave immediately. It's way too dangerous. So Little Chief agrees. Yes, it's dangerous. We have to leave. But first, I need to go down. I run. So he begins to run through the underbrush to a small bend in the stream beyond where the boy was tied. I stopped and smeared wet mud on my face and bare arms to better hide myself. I crossed the stream here and then inched my way towards the pale boy. I moved silently with less noise than a squirrel until I was directly behind a tree, close to the one he was tethered to. My heart thumped in my chest, but I kept my breath quiet and steady so he would not hear me. Then since he had now connected the boy with his white bear dream, he began to really want to get a better look at the boy. And so he kind of poked his head around the tree to look at the boy. And the boy caught him in his eye. He saw him. And the boy was frightened suddenly and started screaming. So at that point, Chicala, a little chief, slipped back into the river or the stream, crossed the stream and got back into the other side and disappeared into the underbrush of the cottonwood trees and found Rabbit. They rushed as fast as they could get back to the horses. And they got onto the horses and ran as hard as they could, got the horses to go as fast as they could away. Because they knew that they had been discovered. But then finally, because the horses were limited in what they could do, they pushed the horses as far as they knew they could dare, and they stopped. But when they stopped, something happened. They heard an unnatural screeching sound that they had never heard before. And it was very frightening because they'd lived all their lives out there in nature. They knew every sound. But suddenly, this sound they had never heard. So they got up and they left. They headed out. But they knew they couldn't run the horses. They knew they couldn't run the horses, but they had to move, but conserve the strength of the horses in the middle of their fear. So then they finally stopped, but the screaming kept happening. But as soon as they stopped, the sound stopped. The interesting thing about this part of the story is that the boys were frightened. But they also had to use judgment. They could not allow their panic to overcome the judgment of their ability and the horse's ability. They had to keep that fear under control. 11-year-old boys in this deep conflict. So as soon as they would stop, though, the sound would stop. So then they would rest, and then they'd start moving again. And then the sound would start up again. But this time, with the sound was accompanied a heavy clomping noise, like a two-legged giant walking. So the screeching and the clomping, bump, bump noises that they kept hearing behind them was added to their fear. And at the same time, they knew they couldn't exhaust the horses. So they worked their way for almost 2 days. Every time they'd stop and rest, all the sounds would stop. But every time they'd start up, the sounds would start up. So then they were finally approaching home, finally getting close to home. And suddenly, when they finally get to home, I've got something else I wanted to read is while I'm doing a little pausing here. The night sounds, the crickets, the wind in the trees, the frogs' buzz of mosquitoes were familiar sounds, but failed to comfort me. Rabbit's breathing grew slow and regular, but my mind was full of all I had seen. Then, when the ease of sleep and dreams was about to take me, I heard an unusual shriek. I jerked upright. Rabbit jumped up to a whisper. "What is that?" says. And then they have to proceed, they proceed on. As we approach the clearing, and as we cleared the open meadow leading towards the camp, one of our uncles rode towards us. He was angry. "Where have you been? Everybody in the village has been searching for you." Rabbit suddenly looked afraid once again. Something has been chasing us. "Never mind," the uncle said, but his anger seemed to evaporate, and he grinned at us. "Get off those poor sick horses. I will tend them. You boys get to the village." We got down off the horses, handed the reins to our uncle, and ran to camp. Yeah. Oh, okay. So as the boys were approaching camp, they turned around and they saw 8 men behind them. They saw Little Rabbit's father, Little Chief's father. They saw their uncles and older cousins behind them. They looked very stern. But as they approached, the father of Little Chief comes up and talks to him and said, "Your mother has been very worried." And Little Chief, of course, and the cousin are feeling, very bad about what they did. Then after they got a little scolding, then the 8 started laughing. And they said, "We knew that you had left. When we discovered you were gone, we tracked you. And we watched you when you went to the creek and you saw the others. And then we followed you home. And your cousin put heavy clomping things on the hind legs of the horse to make that clomping sound. And we made those shrieks for you. So we were following you and protecting you all the way home." So the boys knew that they were safe, and they had been safe all along, but they did not know that. So they had to make their choices based on that, but at the same time, the community protected them. This was a teaching. It was a nurturing teaching. And when they got back, they had a feast for the boys, a welcoming home feast. But the boys were assigned to work with women to prepare for the feast, while the men went out and hunted the game to bring back food for the feast, saying 2 things to the boys. First, you overstepped the boundary. You were not ready to be men yet, but you took on a man's job, a man's task before you were ready. So the line was drawn very clearly. But they also, at the same time, showed them love by giving them a welcoming home feast. So the lessons are clear. The boundary lines are clear in a nurturing way. And then the elders come in and enter into the picture because the elders are the teachers. And so the grandfather, Whirling Hand, comes and talks to the boys and says, "Your mother was very worried." The community, your mothers were very worried. The community was very concerned when you were gone. But we need to talk. I want to talk to you. later, and after you're able to talk to your moms and get together with family, we'll have to have a discussion. And what the elder said to the boys, and he got other elders together, they said, the boys have shown that they're ready for the next stage of training into manhood. Now, the boys violated the boundaries. The elders made that very clear, but they also used it as a sign. The boys were telling them something in that violation, that they were ready to move on into the next stage of training towards manhood. So I wanted to use this story to show a difference. When I was growing up as a child, I constantly, as a boy, got this refrain, what will others think? What will others think? When I got into grade school, my teachers, I remember my second grade teacher. I don't know if she didn't like me or maybe she liked me. She thought she was giving me direction. But she used to shake her head at me and click her tongue. I don't know if any of you had that done, but I don't know if you can hear this, but can you hear that? She would shake her head and go, oh, like this. And I knew I was being shamed. And then I got through grade school and high school, and what will people think? What will people think? Then I had a professor. What will he think? I'll get a grade. Then I had a boss when I got a job. And then I told you about me being 2 minutes late one time, and I got it in my file last week and so on. All this was outside in training. I always had to look to somebody else to see if I was doing it right. What this story is the reverse of that. What these cultures did in raising their children was what I refer to inside out. That's the whole process of nurturing, to nurture a child into adulthood, so that these adults had a strong sense of self. These children, these 11-year-old boys, never forgot that training, but they also never forgot that they were able to deal with their fears and still make it home and still survive. And at the same time, they were being protected. And at the same time, they were given a welcoming feast. Welcome home, we love you. So I wanted to read that story because it follows us into the next section, which, oh my gosh, I went 9 minutes over. I'm sorry. Wow. I guess if you have any questions or discussion or anything like that you would like to bring up, but I'm sorry, I apologize for running over. But yeah, I'm open to anything you want to say.
Remember, you have to unmute yourself before you make any comments or ask any questions.
Okay, well, I just once again want to thank everybody for coming, and again, thanking Lori for her expertise and her help through the process. And the story is a lead-in to next week, so that's kind of the groundwork for moving into what we're going to be covering next week. So if no one has any comment or question, I think we can move on.
I just have a comment. I want to thank you, Gil, for sharing these stories. I didn't used to get them in the first class I took from you, but I really appreciate learning about the Indian culture.
Well, thank you.
It just contributes to my white guilt.
Oh, no, don't do that. No,
I
I appreciate your comment. That's really nice of you.
I have to second when Carolyn's saying, and white guilt, whatever you want to call it, I appreciated the connection between today and just everything that's happening in our minds and in our societies and in our city and in our cultures. Lots and lots to think about.
Oh yeah, I so agree with you, Judy. It's really a time to really have an experience of concern. I think the teaching of the story is also to keep our fears in the proper place and to understand that we still we have each other, which I think is one of the most valuable lessons in the story itself. At the same time, yes, and we can do this. You know, we have COVID-19, but we're doing this. We're not allowing COVID-19 to stop us. We're still moving forward. It's a great feeling. Thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bill, I have a question. This is Louise. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yes.
So did they release the little boy that was, you know, roped to the tree? I couldn't understand if they really cut that rope and he got free or not.
No, not then. The story goes on like this was just a summary of about 1/5 of the book. The book goes on. It's a very powerful book about the boys and how they grow. And I don't want to give too much of the book in case some of you might want to order it. So I'll just briefly say that as the boys matured and they gained the proper skills of being young men, the elders let them know that they were ready to fulfill that dream. And so they did.
So Gil,
Yes.
how did the Lakota people treat their people with disabilities and mental health issues and people that were different within their own culture?
Yeah, they took care of them, made sure they were fed, and they took care of them. There are a lot of cases, some cases of that. But that's an excellent question too, because it allows me to bring up the difference between an exclusive thought process and an inclusive thought process. Why the Jamestown people weren't driven off immediately, why Plymouth wasn't driven off immediately. That also goes into their culture. Remember a few weeks ago I talked about the Winkte, which is an LGBT person I knew by the name of Lorenzo Blue Thunder, and the Sundance and his beautiful voice. Now, that's not true today of all Lakotas because of the force of another culture. But in the traditional culture, Winktes were honored. They were considered confidants because they saw the world differently. So people who had like disabilities were taken care of in these cultures. And the thing about them, they had a wisdom that other people didn't have. Just like the Winktes in Lakota culture, they had a different life and a different challenge in life. And out of that came a different way of seeing. And so people like that also would be confidants. If there's something that you were having trouble with in your life, they would be somebody, it'd be like we go to a psychologist today, maybe, you know, a counselor. But the Winktes and the other people, maybe with a disability, who had a different life experience and saw life differently, would have a wisdom that maybe I wouldn't have. And so they fit into the culture in different ways and that kind of thing. I really like these questions. Thank you.
Hey, Gil,
Yes.
are you going to be leaving some time in the last class to speculate on what the future of the actual age may be and the future of, well, the different worldviews that
Sure.
you've been discussing
Okay,
in this course?
thank you.
Are you
Sorry.
going to do
Alan?
speculation on?
Yeah. Yeah. Alan, are
Yeah.
you reading my mind?
Well, I try to. I mean,
Yeah, right. I mean, that's exactly the last slide in the whole program.
I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else? Well, Lori, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you guys.
Thanks to everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Gil.
same. Bye.
Thank you.